Number 10. The Plague of Ashdod. Around the 11th century BC, along the coastal plain of what is now southern Israel, a Philistine army returned from war carrying the greatest prize of their generation. Not gold, not silver, not even slaves. They carried the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred wooden chest of the Israelites gilded with beaten gold, topped with two winged cherubim, and believed to contain the very tablets Moses had brought down from Sinai. It was to capture the God of their enemies. The Philistines marched the ark into the city of Ashdod, one of the 5 great Philistine cities of the Pentapolis, and set it inside the temple of their own storm and grain god, Dagon, a trophy of war, a demonstration to every farmer, fisherman, and soldier in Philistia that the invisible God of Israel had been beaten. On the first morning, priests entered the temple and found the great stone statue of Dagon lying on its face in front of the ark. They lifted the idol back into place and quietly went home. On the second morning, they returned and found Dagon on the ground again. But this time, the head and both hands of the statue had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only the mutilated trunk of the god remained. And then the swellings began. Men, women, and children in Ashdod started to develop hot, painful lumps in the groin and armpits. The lumps swelled to the size of eggs, then to the size of fists. Fever came next, then vomiting, then delirium, then death. And along with the swellings came something even stranger. The city was overrun by mice. The ancient Greek Septuagint version of the story adds a detail the Hebrew text is more restrained about. It says, the fields in the cities burst up with rodents, that mice were produced in astonishing numbers, and that there was, in the words of the text, the confusion of a great death in the city. The Philistines panicked. They shipped the ark to the neighboring city of Gath. The plague followed. They shipped it to Ekron. The plague followed and struck even harder there, killing so many people. The text notes that even those who did not die were tormented by the tumors. After 7 months of misery, the Philistine lords convened an emergency council and made a decision that would echo through 3,000 years of religious history. They put the ark on a cart, pulled by 2 cows, and with it they placed a guilt offering. 5 models of the tumors, cast in solid gold, and 5 models of mice cast in solid gold. Then they let the cows walk. Wherever they went, the Philistines followed at a distance, praying they were going anywhere but back to Ashdod. The cows walked straight toward Israel. Now here is why modern epidemiologists have spent 200 years arguing over this passage. Because when you strip away the theology, you're left with the earliest description in world literature of a disease that combined swollen lymph nodes in the groin, a plague of rats and mice, a rapid mortality event across multiple connected cities, and a population terrified enough to associate the rodents with the deaths. That combination has one clinical name: bubonic plague. Buboes, rats, mass mortality. Fear. It is all there, described in a Bronze Age text hundreds of years before the Greeks invented history. There is a scholarly counter-argument, and it is worth acknowledging. Black rats did not spread widely into the Near East until later centuries. So some historians argue this cannot literally be Yersinia pestis. Others counter that the mice mentioned in the text are not necessarily black rats and that the description fits too neatly to be coincidence. What we can say for certain is this: something terrible happened in the Philistine cities in the 11th century BC, something so terrible that 3,000 years later, when the French painter Nicolas Poussin wanted to depict human beings at their most helpless before divine judgment, he chose this scene, and he filled it with rats. Whatever killed the people of Ashdod, they believed it came out of a wooden box carrying the anger of a god they had underestimated. And whether you take the theology or leave it the description they left behind is unmistakable. The oldest recorded plague in Western literature, dressed in religious language but wearing the anatomy of a killer that would return again and again for the next 3,000 years. Number 9. The Han Dynasty Epidemics. In the year 196 AD, a middle-aged physician named Zhang Zhongzheng sat down in the Chinese province of Nanyang and began to write. What he wrote would become the foundation text of traditional Chinese medicine studied for 1,800 years afterward, translated into a dozen languages, and consulted by acupuncturists and herbalists on 4 continents. But the reason he wrote it was grief. His clan had once numbered more than 200 people. In less than 10 years, 2/3 of them were dead. He watched his brothers die. He watched his cousins die. He watched aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews follow one after another into shallow graves he was too exhausted to properly dig. And 70% of those deaths, by his own careful accounting, came from a single family of diseases he called cold damage, Shanghan. His book, The Treatise on Cold Damage and Miscellaneous Diseases, would become sacred medical scripture. But it was born in a mass grave. Zhang Zhongjing was living through the death of a 400-year-old dynasty. From roughly the middle of the 2nd century AD onward, wave after wave of epidemic disease rolled across Han China. The historical annals record no fewer than 5 major outbreaks during the Jianan reign period alone, between 196 and 219 AD, and there were many more before that. Whole towns were emptied. Villages became ghost settlements. The historian Sima Biao described empty streets where once markets had crowded with silk merchants and rice vendors. In some regions, the tax rolls collapsed because there was simply no one left alive to tax. What was killing them? We do not entirely know. Cold damage in classical Chinese medicine was less a specific pathogen and more a category of febrile illness. Modern scholars have suggested typhus, smallpox, measles, or even a version of the same disease that hit Rome as the Antonine Plague, arriving via the Silk Road. The dates line up almost perfectly. And here is where the plague reached beyond the sickbed and reshaped an empire. Because when your world is collapsing, when your parents are dying, when your children are dying, when the state cannot help, and the emperor cannot help, and the traditional gods cannot help, you go looking for someone who can. In the countryside of Hebei province, a Taoist faith healer named Zhang Ju began telling desperate villagers that he could cure the epidemic. He offered charmed water, he offered incantations, he offered confession rituals. And, most dangerously, he offered a theology. The Han Dynasty, he said, had lost the mandate of heaven. The plague was proof. A new age of great peace was coming, and the sky itself would change color to yellow. His followers began wearing yellow cloth wrapped around their heads. By 184 AD, Zhang Ju commanded a movement of hundreds of thousands of plague-shattered peasants across 8 provinces of the empire. He and his 2 brothers launched a coordinated uprising that Chinese historians remember as the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The Han government threw everything it had at them: armies of 350,000 men, provincial governors given extraordinary emergency powers, local warlords authorized to raise their own private militias. The rebellion was crushed within a year. Zhang Ju died of illness in October 184. His brothers were killed in battle, but the empire that emerged from the war was not the empire that had gone into it. The provincial governors who had been given the power to raise armies did not give that power back. The warlords became kingmakers. Within 36 years, the Han Dynasty was formally extinguished, replaced by the era of the Three Kingdoms, one of the most romanticized and bloodiest periods in Chinese history. 400 years of imperial continuity ended by an epidemic, and the rebellion it inspired. Zhang Zhongjing survived all of it. He kept writing, he kept treating patients. He established a system where he opened his government office to the poor on the 1st and 15th of every month, treating anyone who came, refusing payment. The Chinese later called him the Sage of Medicine. He is the reason that 1,800 years later, herbalists in Shanghai and Los Angeles still prescribe formulas he first wrote down while burying his family. But the deeper legacy is quieter and darker. It is this: when an empire dies, we look for a general to blame, or a bad emperor, or a corrupt eunuch, or a barbarian invasion. But sometimes the killer is smaller than any of that. Sometimes the killer is a virus, or a bacterium, or a parasite. And sometimes it changes everything. Number 8. The Amarna Epidemic. In the 1340s BC, in the middle of the Egyptian desert, a pharaoh built a city from nothing. His name was Akhenaten. He was the son of Amenhotep III, the husband of Nefertiti, and the possible father of Tutankhamun. And he was, by any reasonable measure, one of the strangest kings ever to sit on any throne in the ancient world. He decided one day that the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods worshipped for 2,000 years could be discarded. There was only one god now, he said, the sun disk, the Aten, and to worship this god properly, Egypt needed a new capital built on virgin soil, untouched by the shrines of the old religion. So he built one. He called it Akhetaten. Today we call it Amarna. Within 15 years, the city was thriving. Palaces, temples, workshops, and villas for 20,000 or 30,000 inhabitants, all built on a bend of the Nile that had been empty desert only a few years before. And then, within another few years, it was dead. The court left. The population scattered. The palaces were dismantled, and their stones carried away to build other pharaohs' monuments. The new religion was extinguished, the old gods restored, and Akhenaten's name was chiseled off every wall that could be reached with a chisel. For decades, one of the most popular explanations Egyptologists reached for was plague. And on the surface, the timing was suspicious. Multiple members of Akhenaten's royal family died within a few years of each other. His mother-in-law, Tiye, several of his daughters, including the beloved Meketaten, whose death scene is carved into the walls of a royal tomb showing the king and queen, collapsed in grief. His secondary wife, Kia, vanished from the record. And then Akhenaten himself was gone. Then his mysterious successor, Smenkhare, was gone. Then a boy king took the throne and reigned briefly before he too died in his teens. His name was Tutankhamun, and here is where the story reaches beyond Egypt's borders. Because 800 kilometers to the north, in the Hittite Empire, a young king named Mursili II wrote a series of prayers complaining that an epidemic had entered his lands and that it had come with Egyptian prisoners of war captured by his father's armies. Diplomatic letters from allies across the Bronze Age Mediterranean, preserved on clay tablets in the Amarna archive itself, complain of pestilence in cities like Megiddo, Byblos, and Sumur. Something was moving through the ancient Near East, something that killed royalty. And the coincidence of a dying royal family in Amarna, a plague blamed on Egyptian soldiers in Hattusa, and letters describing disease outbreaks in half a dozen client kingdoms seemed too neat to be coincidence. Now, in fairness, a major new study published in 2025 by the archaeologists Gretchen Dabbs and Anna Stevens, based on the analysis of 880 burials excavated from Amarna's cemeteries between 2005 and 2022, argues that the physical bioarchaeological evidence for a mass plague at Amarna specifically is much weaker than earlier theories assumed. Most of the skeletal signs suggest chronic malnutrition, hard labor, and social stress, not the sudden mass mortality signature of an epidemic. But even the researchers who challenge the Amarna-specific plague theory agree that something was happening in the wider Bronze Age world. The Hittite prayers are real. The Amarna letters are real. Diplomats really were writing to each other about plague in their cities. What may have happened is not one clean epidemic centered on Akhenaten's dying capital, but a broader pattern of disease that quietly moved through the interconnected trade networks of the late Bronze Age, striking here, sparing there, killing royals and peasants alike, and reshaping the diplomatic map of the ancient world for generations. Whatever it was invisible to the Egyptians. They had no germ theory. They had no idea that fleas or lice or contaminated water might carry death. They had only the gods. And when those gods failed to protect them, they did what humans have always done. They tried new ones, then abandoned them, then went back to the old ones and prayed the sickness would pass. Amarna, in the end, became a ghost city. Modern excavators walk through what was once one of the largest planned cities in the ancient world, and they find silence. Whatever role plague played in that silence. The fact that we are still arguing about it 3,300 years later is itself a kind of testimony. In the ancient world, when a great city died suddenly and completely disease was one of the first suspects anyone reached for, because everyone alive at the time had seen what disease could do. Number 7. The Neolithic Plague. Sweden, roughly 2900 BC, in a low green field in the parish of Gokem, in what is now Falbygden, in western Sweden, a group of farmers built a passage tomb. It was a simple structure by later standards, a rectangular limestone chamber, entered through a low corridor of upright stones covered by an earthen mound, and sealed at the entrance with a heavy slab. Into that chamber, they carried their dead. Not one body, not two, but eventually, at least 78 people, and here's what makes this tomb one of the most disturbing archaeological finds ever made. All 78 of those individuals were buried in a window of roughly 200 years. That is not a lot of time for a small farming community to bury that many people in a single collective grave. It is the kind of number that requires an explanation. For decades, archaeologists knew about the passage grave at Frelsgarden, but they did not know why so many people had been buried there so quickly. Then, in 2018, a team of researchers led by the biologist Nicholas Raskoven and the geneticist Simon Rasmussen decided to do something no one had thought to do before. They took ancient DNA that had already been extracted from the teeth of the buried, and they screened it not for the DNA of the humans themselves, but for the DNA of anything else that might be present. Anything a person might be carrying in their bloodstream at the moment they died. What they found stopped them cold. The teeth of a 20-year-old woman and the teeth of a 20-year-old man buried in the same tomb both contained the unmistakable genetic signature of Yersinia pestis, plague, the same bacterium that would kill Justinian's Constantinople 3,400 years later, the same bacterium that would kill half of medieval Europe as the Black Death 5,300 years later. And here it was, in the teeth of a Neolithic farmer whose face had never seen a bronze tool, let alone iron. This was not just old plague. It was the oldest strain of plague ever recovered, an entire branch of the evolutionary tree of Yersinia pestis that scientists had never known existed. A version of the disease that had been quietly circulating through humans thousands of years before Egypt built the pyramids. And here is why this discovery is genuinely one of the most important in modern archaeology. Because for a long time, prehistorians had been puzzled by something called the Neolithic decline. Across Europe, during the exact period represented by the Frelsgarden tomb, farming communities that had been booming for centuries suddenly collapsed. Enormous settlements, some of them holding tens of thousands of people at sites like the Tropilium mega settlements of what is now Ukraine, were abandoned and burned. Populations crashed, trade networks fell apart, entire cultures vanished, replaced only centuries later by newcomers from the steppe. No one had a good explanation. War could not account for it. Climate change alone did not fit. Famine did not match the timing. Now there was a candidate. A plague that could have moved through the newly connected trade routes of Neolithic Europe, spreading from settlement to settlement along the paths that carried grain and pottery and copper. A disease that would have been catastrophic in populations that had never encountered it before. A killer that could empty a village in a single summer and leave the survivors too shattered to rebuild. If the theory is correct, then the mysterious disappearance of Neolithic Europe was not caused by invasions or climate, but by our species' most familiar enemy, arriving 5,000 years earlier than anyone had ever suspected. The passage tomb at Frelsgarden, in this reading, is not just a burial site. It is a mass grave from humanity's first pandemic. The people inside it are the earliest identifiable victims of a bacterium that would go on to kill more human beings than every war in history combined. And they had no idea. They had no name for it. They had no theory of contagion. They only had the slow horror of watching neighbors and children and parents die of the same illness one after another, and the burden of carrying the bodies into the low stone chamber that would become the archaeological record of humanity's oldest confirmed enemy. The next time you hear someone say the plague began in medieval Europe, Remember Frelsgarden. It began in the Stone Age. It has been with us the whole time. Number 6. The Plague Prayers of Mursili II. Central Anatolia, roughly 1320 BC, in the great Hittite capital of Hattusa, a young man had just become king. His name was Mursili II. He was the youngest son of Suppiluliuma I, the greatest warrior king the Hittites had ever produced. And Mursili had inherited the throne because everyone else in front of him had died. His father, dead. His older brother Arnuanda II, dead. Their wives, their children, cousins, court officials, scribes, priests, a generation of nobility mowed down like wheat. And Mursili knew why. His father's armies, marching south into what is now Lebanon during a campaign against Egyptian client states, had captured a large number of Egyptian prisoners of war. The prisoners had been sick. The illness had followed them home to Hattusa. And in the capital of one of the great powers of the Bronze Age world, in a mountain fortress the Hittites had believed was blessed by their storm god, it had begun to burn through the population. Now, 20 years later, it was still burning. The plague had reduced armies, emptied villages, killed priests before they could complete rituals, killed farmers before they could bring in harvests. And Mursili, in what has to rank as one of the most desperate acts of statecraft in human history, sat down at his royal desk and began to write letters to the gods. We have those letters. They survived on clay tablets buried in the archives of Hattusa when the city was destroyed centuries later and rediscovered by German archaeologists in the early 20th century. Scholars call them the Plague Prayers of Mursili II, and they are unlike anything else in ancient literature. Because Mursili was not just praying, he was negotiating. He addressed the great storm god Tarhunta directly. He acknowledged that the plague must be divine punishment. He then went about the work of trying to figure out what the gods were angry about and how to make it stop. In one prayer, he confessed on behalf of his own father. He admitted that Suppiluliuma had, decades earlier, broken a sacred treaty with Egypt. He admitted that his father had been involved in the assassination of a rival for the throne, a nephew named Tudalia the Younger, who had a legitimate claim to the kingship. He confessed these sins publicly, on tablets that were read out in temples, and he begged the gods to accept his father's guilt and lift the plague from a new generation that had done nothing wrong. In another prayer, he pleaded for an oracle. "Tell me," he wrote, "tell me what I have to do. Speak to me through a dream. Speak to me through a prophet. Speak to me through a priest. Only tell me the price and I will pay it. Hatti," he wrote, "has been cruelly afflicted by the plague. For 20 years now, men have been dying. The few that were left will die too." This is not the voice of an all-powerful god king. This is the voice of a young man trying to save what is left of his father's empire from an invisible enemy that has already killed most of the people he loved. And the truly extraordinary thing is that at times, Mursili sounds almost angry with the gods. He points out that if all the priests die, no one will be left to make offerings to them. If all the farmers die, no one will be left to grow the barley for the sacrificial bread. If all the herders die, no one will be left to raise the sheep for the sacrificial lambs. It is, he tells the gods bluntly, in their own interest to make the plague stop. What did Mursili not know? He did not know that his prisoners of war had probably not carried the disease deliberately. He did not know that in a mountain city with thousands of people crowded together, any imported pathogen would spread with terrifying speed. He did not know that his gods were not listening because his gods were not there. He only knew that his people were dying and that as king, he was responsible. Eventually, the plague seems to have burned itself out. Historians estimate the outbreak lasted around 20 years, roughly. One full human generation, enough time for immune resistance to build in the survivors. Mursili did not live to see the end of his empire. That would come almost 150 years later when Hattusa was sacked and burned by mysterious invaders during the Great Bronze Age collapse. But he did leave us something extraordinary. He left us the voice of a king in the middle of an epidemic, refusing to give up, negotiating with heaven itself, writing down his prayers so that scribes could read them aloud in the presence of statues that had already failed to save his father, his brother, and half his court. When historians look for the birth of political medicine of a ruler treating an epidemic as a state emergency rather than a private tragedy, they often look to Mursili, because 3,300 years before COVID, he understood the essential truth. If the plague does not stop, the empire does not survive. And so he did the only thing his culture allowed him to do. He wrote to the gods, and he waited. Number 5. The Plague of Athens. 430 BC, the Peloponnesian War had begun the year before. Sparta and its allies had invaded the Athenian countryside, burning fields and vineyards. And Pericles, the great statesman of Athens, had made a strategic decision. Athens, he said, could not defeat Sparta on land, but Athens ruled the sea. So instead of meeting the invaders in open battle, he withdrew the entire population of Attica behind the long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus. Farmers, herders, artisans, entire villages, all crammed inside a city built for a fraction of their number. It was a brilliant strategy. It was also, as it turned out, the perfect setup for a catastrophe. Because in the spring of 430 BC, a ship arrived from Egypt carrying grain. And with the grain, something else came ashore. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the epidemic and caught it himself, and who miraculously survived to write about it, described the arrival of the disease with the cold precision of a general watching an enemy advance. It began, he said, in the harbor. First, the healthy would suddenly and without warning be struck with violent heats in the head. Then their eyes would turn red and inflamed, their throats and tongues would become blood red, their breath became foul. Then came coughing, sneezing, hoarseness, then vomiting, then diarrhea, then a burning sensation so intense that many victims threw themselves into the public fountains and cisterns of the city, trying to cool the fire inside them. Many died in the water, many died on the streets, many died in their homes, alone, because everyone else in their family had already died, or because those who had not were terrified to enter the room. And here, Thucydides, who had begun as a clinical observer, became something else. He became a witness to the collapse of a society. Because the plague did not just kill Athenians, it broke them. Funerals became meaningless. Bodies were dumped onto strangers' funeral pyres if they were dumped anywhere at all. Wealthy people who had inherited fortunes suddenly, from dead relatives, spent them on wild pleasure because they believed they would be dead in a week themselves. Temples filled with dying refugees who had come to pray and who instead infected the priests. Laws were ignored because no one believed there would be a state left to enforce them. The city became, in Thucydides' phrase, a spectacle of moral corruption. And in the middle of this, Pericles, the man who had brought them all inside the walls, watched his own family die. His sister, his 2 sons by his first wife, his closest friends. And finally, in 429 BC, Pericles himself, the greatest statesman of the Golden Age of Athens, died in his bed of a disease he had helped concentrate by his own military strategy. Modern estimates suggest the plague killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of Athens' entire population, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people. Over the roughly 4 years, the outbreak persisted. The Athenian army in the field lost so many men that they could not maintain the offensives Pericles had planned. What the disease was, we are still not sure. In 1994, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave in the ancient Keramikos cemetery containing at least 150 hastily buried bodies dating to the exact year the plague broke out. DNA analysis of teeth from that grave detected salmonella enterica, suggesting typhoid fever as one plausible culprit. But other researchers have argued for smallpox, or typhus, or an early form of Ebola, or a disease that no longer exists at all. A 2025 review, integrating clinical, archaeological, and DNA evidence, concluded that invasive non-typhoidal salmonella fits the historical description best, but the debate is not settled and probably never will be. What we do know is that Athens, after the plague, was not the same city Athens had been before it. Its confidence was broken. Its manpower was crippled. Its political system, though it continued to fight for another 25 years, gradually lost the reserve of talent and morale that had built the Parthenon. when Athens finally fell to Sparta in 404 BC, ending the Peloponnesian War. Historians have long argued that the killing blow had been struck decades earlier, not by a Spartan spear, but by a pathogen that arrived in a grain ship, and they killed the man who might otherwise have led Athens to victory. Thucydides survived and wrote it all down. He is, in many ways, the founder of modern epidemiology, not because he understood microbes, but because he refused to interpret the plague as divine punishment. He watched it, he recorded the symptoms, he documented the timeline. He noted that survivors did not fall sick a second time, an early insight into acquired immunity. And he preserved the moral tragedy alongside the clinical facts. His book is why we still know their names, their fear, their courage, their collapse. The Plague of Athens is one of the earliest and most vivid case studies of what happens when a great civilization meets a great pathogen at the exact worst moment. And Athens at that moment was already inside its own walls with no way out. Number 4. The Antonine Plague. The year is 165 AD, and the Roman Empire has reached its greatest extent from the wet moors of Scotland to the burning sands of southern Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Everyone lives under one government, one currency, one legal system, and increasingly, one language. The emperor is Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who will one day write the Meditations. His adopted brother Lucius Verus rules alongside him as co-emperor. And Lucius Verus has just been given his first major military assignment: push back a Parthian invasion that has swept through the eastern provinces. It should have been a triumph. The Roman legions were the finest fighting force in the ancient world. Their generals were experienced. Their logistics were unrivaled. And after several years of hard campaigning, they broke the Parthian defenses and captured, among other prizes, the great Mesopotamian city of Seleucia on the Tigris River. And here, according to Roman legend, the plague began. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus preserved a story that Roman soldiers looting the city broke into a sealed temple. Inside, they found a golden casket, and when they opened it, something came out: a pestilent air, a curse, a punishment for their impiety. Modern historians roll their eyes at the temple story. It was almost certainly a piece of religious moralizing invented after the fact to explain why the invincible Roman legions had suddenly become a delivery system for a disease. But something happened in the East during that campaign. Because when the legions came home, they brought the plague with them. It reached Smyrna in Roman Anatolia in 165 AD, where the famous orator Aelius Aristides caught it and nearly died. It reached Rome itself by 166 AD. By 172 AD, it had spread to nearly every corner of the empire. And it was unlike anything Roman medicine had ever seen. The physician Galen, the greatest doctor of the ancient world, was in Rome when the plague hit. He described the symptoms with careful attention: high fever, diarrhea, vomiting, a raging thirst, a sore swollen throat, coughing, and most distinctively, black pustules erupting across the skin on the 9th day of illness. Then either the patient recovered or they died. Modern scholars have long argued the disease was smallpox, or an ancestor of it. Recent genetic studies of the measles virus have suggested measles is too young a pathogen to have been responsible. Some researchers now argue for an ancestor of smallpox or a viral hemorrhagic fever we cannot precisely identify. Whatever it was, the numbers were staggering. At its peak, around 2,000 people were dying every day in Rome alone. Estimates for the total death toll across the 15 years the plague raged range from 5 million to 10 million people, roughly 10% of the empire's total population. And critically, the legions were hit hardest of all. Soldiers crammed together in barracks and marching camps were perfect incubators. Recruiting officers scrambled to fill units. Standards were lowered. Slaves and gladiators were pressed into service. And in 169 AD, something happened that had not happened in over a century of Roman military dominance. A co-emperor died of disease. Lucius Verus, returning from a campaign against Germanic tribes on the Danube frontier, was struck by what may have been the plague. He died at the age of 38 in the northern Italian city of Altinum. Marcus Aurelius buried him and kept fighting. Galen, meanwhile, did something a modern reader will not entirely admire. He left Rome. He left the city at the height of the outbreak and retreated to his family estates in Asia Minor. He rationalized it as a call to prepare for the war on the Danube, and he did eventually return. But there is a striking image in his story. The greatest physician alive, watching his patients die, and choosing survival over service. It is a very human moment inside a very inhuman crisis. The Antonine Plague did not destroy the Roman Empire. Rome would go on. Marcus Aurelius would rule for another 15 years, spending most of his reign at the frontier, fighting one war after another, writing philosophy in his tent by lamplight. But the plague had done something quieter and more permanent. It had gutted the manpower reserves that made the Roman military machine work. It had disrupted the tax base, it had emptied whole regions, and it had introduced for the first time in generations the possibility that Rome might not always win. When Edward Gibbon, 1600 years later, wrote his famous Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he chose to begin his story after the reign of Marcus Aurelius, calling the age before it the happiest and most prosperous the human race had ever known. What Gibbon did not fully appreciate was that even inside that supposedly golden age, Rome had already met its first great invisible enemy, and it had lost. Number 3. The Plague of Cyprian, the Roman Empire, 249 AD. Rome was in the middle of what modern historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Emperors were being murdered by their own soldiers in less than a year. Barbarian tribes were breaking across the Rhine and the Danube. The economy was collapsing under runaway inflation. And into this already broken world, a new plague arrived. It seems to have started in Ethiopia around Easter of 250 AD. From there, it traveled north through Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and into every major city of the empire. In Carthage, on the North African coast, the bishop of the city was a former lawyer and Roman senator's son named Thascius Caecilius Cyprianus. History remembers him simply as Cyprian. And when the plague hit his city, he did not run. He organized burial teams. He preached to the sick. He rallied the small Christian community of Carthage into what may have been the first organized epidemic response in the Western world. And along the way, he sat down and wrote a sermon called De Mortalitate, on the mortality. It is the single most detailed eyewitness description of any ancient plague we possess. And it reads like a horror story. Cyprian described the symptoms in unflinching detail. The bowels loosen into a constant flux that dissolves the strength of the body. A fire begins in the deep marrow of the bones and burns outward, breaking the throat into ulcerated wounds. The intestines convulse with continuous vomiting. The eyes fill with blood so that they burn as if with a real fire. In some patients, gangrene spreads across the feet and lower legs, blackening and rotting the flesh until the extremities are lost. Some go deaf. Some go blind. Some lose the use of their legs and lie paralyzed on their beds, waiting for the end. And they die. Cyprian wrote, in numbers so vast that his community cannot bury them. Contemporary reports, quoted by later chroniclers, describe 5,000 deaths per day in the city of Rome at the height of the outbreak. Whole towns emptied. In Alexandria, the bishop Dionysius wrote that the population of the city was gutted. Whole streets fell silent. In Rome, 2 emperors died in succession, Hostilin and possibly Claudius II Gothicus, though the exact cause of Claudius's death is debated. The empire itself nearly cracked open, and Cyprian, in his sermon, refused to soften what he was seeing. This is a trial, he wrote to his congregation. This is a test. The Christian, he insisted, must not fear death because for the believer, death is only a passage. But for the pagan world, watching the plague sweep through cities they had believed were eternal, the message was more chilling. Cyprian wrote, in one of his letters against the intellectual Demetrianus, that even the physical world was failing. The rains no longer fell in the same quantities, the harvests were shrinking, the mines were producing less silver. Old age was arriving earlier. Everything that seemed permanent was slowly dissolving. The world, he wrote, is dying. The Plague of Cyprian lasted in one form or another for roughly 20 years, from 249 to 262 AD, possibly with echoes lingering into the 270s. Modern historians have argued about what caused it. Smallpox is one candidate, though the description does not quite fit. Measles is another. Some researchers have suggested an early filovirus, something in the same family as Ebola or Marburg. The bleeding eyes, the massive gastrointestinal collapse, the extraordinary mortality rate all fit the hemorrhagic fever profile. Others have argued for pandemic influenza. We do not know. We may never know. The pathogen died out or evolved into something else, and it left no genetic trace we have yet identified. What it did leave was people like Cyprian. Christian communities, which had until then been a small and often persecuted minority, gained an enormous reputation during the plague because they refused to abandon the sick. Pagan neighbors who had been left to die alone were nursed by Christians who believed they had a duty to serve. Recent scholarship has debated exactly how much this contributed to the eventual Christianization of Rome, but the perception at the time was powerful. When your neighbors are throwing bodies into the streets and the man knocking on your door with a bowl of broth is a Christian, it changes what the word Christian means. Cyprian himself did not live to see the full outcome. In 258 AD, during a resurgence of imperial persecution under the Emperor Valerian, he was arrested for refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods. He was tried, sentenced, and beheaded on the 14th of September, 258 AD. His last recorded words to the executioner were reportedly a blessing. His plague, though, kept going for at least another 4 years. What Cyprian understood, and what he tried to make his readers understand, was that a great empire is not what it looks like on the surface. The marble columns, and the parading legions, and the well-paved roads, and the coin with the emperor's face can hide a society already coming apart. And the disease that arrives in that moment does not just kill people. It exposes what was already collapsing. His verdict, delivered from the pulpit of a plague city, still lands hard. The world, he wrote, is dying. He was not wrong. Just a little early. Number 2, the Plague of Justinian, 541 AD. The Roman Empire had officially ended in the West, 65 years earlier, when a barbarian named Odoacer had deposed the last Western emperor. But in the East, from the great city of Constantinople, a Roman emperor named Justinian I was in the middle of an ambitious project. He was going to put the empire back together. His generals, especially the brilliant Belisarius, had already reconquered North Africa from the Vandals. They were fighting a long, bloody, but successful war to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths. Justinian was rewriting the entire body of Roman law into what would become the famous Justinianic Code, the foundation of every European legal system for the next 1,500 years. He was building the enormous domed church of Hagia Sophia, which still stands in Istanbul today. And then, in the summer of 541 AD, a ship arrived at the Egyptian port of Pelusium near the mouth of the Nile. And whatever had come on that ship, or the ones that followed it, was different from anything the Mediterranean world had seen before. The disease that emerged is now known, thanks to modern DNA analysis of remains from mass graves across Europe, to be Yersinia pestis, bubonic plague, the same organism that had killed Neolithic Swedes 4,400 years earlier, the same organism that would return 800 years later to kill half of medieval Europe as the Black Death. But this was the first time it appeared in the historical record as a fully documented pandemic, and Constantinople was about to become the epicenter. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness who left one of our fullest accounts, described what happened when the plague reached the imperial capital. It began, he said, with a fever so mild that people did not even go to bed. Then, on the same day, or the day after, buboes began to appear, swollen, painful lymph nodes in the groin, the armpits, and beside the ears. And then either the patient recovered or they died. At the peak of the outbreak, Procopius claimed 10,000 people were dying every day in Constantinople alone. Some modern scholars think that number is inflated, but even more sober contemporary estimates from writers like John of Ephesus describe 5,000, 7,000, 12,000, and sometimes 16,000 deaths per single day. And the city, one of the largest in the world at the time with perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, could not keep up. Graveyards overflowed, then filled, then were abandoned. Justinian, according to Procopius, appointed a private secretary named Theodore to handle the crisis. Theodore ordered soldiers to dig enormous pits across the Golden Horn. When the pits filled, the corpses were carried up onto the fortress towers of the sea walls, the roofs were removed, and the bodies were packed into the towers themselves, layer after layer, sprinkled with lime. When the towers filled, the roofs were replaced, the stench of the city, Procopius wrote, was unbearable for months afterward. Cores were loaded onto flat-bottomed boats and rowed out into the Sea of Marmara to be dumped overboard. Some ships were simply set on fire while still full and pushed out from the harbor. And Justinian himself caught it. The emperor, at the height of the outbreak in 542, developed the swellings and the fever. His wife, Theodora, one of the most powerful women in the ancient world, nursed him personally, and for weeks it was unclear whether the emperor would live. He lived, a quarter of Constantinople did not. Estimates for total mortality across the first wave of the pandemic, which spread across the entire Mediterranean world between 541 and 549 AD, range from 25 million to 50 million people, roughly 1/4 to 1/2 of the population of every affected region. In some coastal cities, entire streets were left empty. Farms went untended. Tax revenues collapsed. The armies Justinian had used to reconquer Italy and Africa now had no reinforcements. And the plague did not just come once. It kept returning. Historians have documented at least 18 separate waves of the Justinianic plague across the eastern Mediterranean and Europe over the next 2 centuries, well into the 8th century AD. Every time the survivors thought it might be over, the buboes appeared again, in a city, in a village, in a monastery, and the burial parties would go back to work. The wider consequences reshaped the ancient world. Justinian's dream of reunifying the Roman Empire failed, not because his generals were incompetent, but because he no longer had the men or the money to hold what they had won. Within a century, most of his reconquests were lost. The Eastern Empire itself would be shrunken by continuing plague waves, weakened just as a new religious and political power, Islam, was emerging out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. Some historians have argued that the Plague of Justinian is one of the key reasons the early Arab conquests met such thin resistance in Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. The soldiers who might have defended those provinces were already dead. Justinian himself lived until 565 AD, ruling for over 3 decades after his own recovery. He never spoke publicly about his illness, but the historian Procopius, in his savage secret history, hinted that the plague had broken something in the emperor. He grew more suspicious, more withdrawn, more theological, more punitive. He had watched a quarter of his capital die, and he had lain in bed himself feeling the swellings in his own groin, and he had survived. That kind of thing changes a person. What lingers, at the end, is Procopius's description of the mood of Constantinople during the height of the epidemic. The city, he wrote, fell into an eerie silence. The great markets emptied, the bureaucracy stopped functioning. Even the criminals, he noted with grim amusement, seemed to have stopped stealing because there was nothing worth stealing, and no one left to arrest them. Only the burial teams moved through the streets carrying their unbearable cargo up to the towers. It is the closest thing the ancient world ever produced to a photograph of the end of the world. And it was real. Number 1. The Lugano Infant Cemetery. Central Italy, roughly 450 AD. In the little Umbrian hill country north of Rome in the region we now know as Lugano, in Teverina, the Western Roman Empire, was in its final stages of collapse. Barbarian kingdoms were carving up the provinces. The imperial administration was hollowing out. Christianity had become the official religion of the empire more than a century earlier, and the old pagan gods were, at least on paper, no longer supposed to be worshipped. But something was killing the children. Along the marshy river valleys of central Italy, malaria had been endemic for centuries. Mosquitoes carrying the parasite, Plasmodium most dangerously, Plasmodium falciparum, thrived in the wetlands. In the 5th century AD, as Roman infrastructure decayed, irrigation and drainage systems collapsed, and stagnant water spread, the mosquito population may have exploded. What we know for certain is that in one specific village near the modern town of Lugano, something catastrophic happened to the young children of the community sometime in the middle of the 5th century. And what those villagers did in response is one of the most disturbing archaeological finds ever made in the ancient world. On the ruins of a 1st century BC Roman villa that had been abandoned for perhaps 300 years, the villagers turned the collapsed rooms into a graveyard. Not a graveyard for adults, a graveyard for babies. Archaeologists led by the University of Arizona's David Soren, who has excavated the site since 1987, uncovered more than 50 burials in the ruined villa, and they were all children. Some were newborns, buried inside broken amphorae, the ceramic wine jars of the ancient Mediterranean, laid on their sides like the tiniest of coffins. Some were fetuses, buried before they had ever taken a breath. Some were toddlers. Almost all of them were under the age of 3. DNA analysis eventually confirmed what Soren had suspected. These children had died of malaria. And the villagers, in the middle of a fully Christian empire, had responded with rituals so old and so pagan they must have thought God himself would not be able to reach them in time. Interred. Alongside the infants were the bones of at least 12 puppies, all under 6 months old, and one dog, roughly a year old, most of them with their heads or lower jaws deliberately cut off. Puppies had a specific role in old Roman folk magic. They were associated with rituals of purification and with warding off malevolent spirits. Somebody in this village was killing puppies, dismembering them, and burying them next to dead babies on the theory that this might keep whatever had killed the babies from claiming more. Other burials contained the severed talons of ravens, birds, long associated with witchcraft and with the underworld. Others contained toad bones, thought to be a folk remedy against fever. One 3-year-old girl was buried with heavy stones placed on her hands and her feet, as if to hold her body in place to keep her from rising. And then, in 2018, the excavators found something even more disturbing: the skeleton of a 10-year-old child. The sex was undetermined, the age was clear from the molar development, and when Soren's team looked at the skull, they saw something that stopped them cold. A large stone had been deliberately forced into the child's mouth after death. The stone bore tooth marks along its surface where it had been pushed past the teeth and wedged between the jaws. It was not a natural inclusion. It was placed there. It was placed there because the villagers believed that the child, if left with an open mouth, would rise from the grave and spread the fever. Archaeologists have a phrase for this. They call it a vampire burial. It is a very rare practice documented in later medieval sites in Poland and elsewhere in Italy, where a corpse suspected of returning from the dead as a revenant would be stabilized with a stone or a brick, or occasionally an iron sickle placed across the throat. What made the Lugano find extraordinary was not just the burial itself, but its context, because up until that discovery, everyone else in the cemetery of the babies had been under 3 years old. This 10-year-old was the oldest child ever found there. The child had an abscessed tooth, a known side effect of severe malaria. The child had died in the same wave of sickness that had already emptied the village of its infants. And when the villagers buried this child, they did something they had not done, at least not this dramatically, for any of the babies. They forced a rock into her mouth, they pushed it past her teeth, they wedged it into the back of her throat, and they carried her into a former villa that had become a mass grave, and they laid her down among the babies. And they hoped it would be enough. Locally, in the town of Lugano, in Teverina, today the villagers called this child the Vampire of Lugano. But what really matters is not the folklore. What matters is the state of mind of the people who buried her. They were terrified. They lived in a Christian empire. They had priests. They had a bishop somewhere within reach. They had the entire theological apparatus of Rome telling them that death was a passage to salvation, that fear was to be rejected, that the old gods were false, and their rituals meaningless. And when their children began dying in numbers they could not comprehend, they threw all of that overboard. They killed puppies. They cut the talons off ravens. They stuffed stones into the mouths of dead 10-year-olds. They resurrected the oldest, darkest folk magic they could remember because the new religion was not stopping the sickness, and they were desperate. This is why the Lugano Infant Cemetery is number 1. Not because it killed the most people. Malaria at Lugano may have taken a few dozen infants across a few short years. The Plague of Justinian killed tens of millions. The Antonine Plague killed millions. Even the Neolithic outbreak in Sweden emptied thousands of villages across a continent. Lugano is number 1 because of what it shows us about the human interior. When an ancient plague was bad enough and the deaths were young enough, it could take a fully Christian European village at the end of the classical world and pull it backwards through 500 years of religious change into a fear so primal that it looked exactly like the terror of the earliest pagan Romans. Lugano is the human cost of every plague on this list made visible in a single grave, a stone in the mouth of a dead child, a parent's last hopeless act of protection against something they did not understand. When you strip away the emperors and the historians and the physicians and the treaties and the trade routes, and you go all the way down to what the plague actually meant, this is what you find. Small graves filled with tiny bodies, guarded by talismans no priest had approved. The Lugano Infant Cemetery is not the largest ancient plague. It is the truest one, because it shows you what disease does to human beings when it takes what human beings love most. And there is no history book, no marble monument, no epic poem that can capture that grief the way one small skull with a stone forced into its mouth can. That is why it belongs at number 1. Not because it was the deadliest, because it was the most human. So there you have it. 10 ancient plagues that killed more people than every war ever fought in the ancient world, and probably every war fought since. From the Philistine cities of the Bronze Age Levant, where the earliest hint of bubonic plague may have arrived hidden inside the greatest religious trophy of the age, to the passage tombs of Neolithic Sweden, where the oldest strain of Yersinia pestis ever recovered still sits in the DNA of a 20-year-old woman who died 4,900 years ago, to the plague prayers of a Hittite king negotiating with his gods for the life of an empire that was quietly bleeding out under his feet, to the walled city of Athens, where a strategic decision to bring the countryside inside the walls became the perfect delivery system for a killer that helped decide the Peloponnesian War, to the Roman legions carrying disease home from Mesopotamia, seeding an empire-wide pandemic that gutted the greatest military machine of the ancient world, to the Bishop of Carthage watching bodies pile up faster than his community could bury them, and telling his readers, without flinching, that the world was dying, to the fortress towers of Constantinople stuffed with corpses, because there was no more earth left, to a Christian village in Umbria that reached back through 500 years of religious change to force a stone into the mouth of a dead 10-year-old, because malaria was killing their babies and the new god was not saving them. Every one of these outbreaks did what every war combined has never done. They emptied cities, they ended dynasties, they rewrote maps. And they did it silently, without armies, without weapons, without warning. If this video changed the way you think about ancient history, do us a favor. Hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel find more curious people like you. Smash subscribe. And turn on the bell if you want more deep dives into the parts of the ancient world that most textbooks skip. And drop a comment below. Tell us which of these plagues shocked you most. Tell us if there is one you had never heard of before this video. Tell us where in the world you are watching from. Our viewers span every continent, and reading through the comments after each video is genuinely one of the best parts of running this channel. Thank you for watching, because in the end, this is what these graves are for, so that the people inside them, from a Neolithic Swedish farmer to a Roman toddler in a broken amphora, are not forgotten. Their names are lost, their languages are dead. Their empires have crumbled, but their bones are still speaking. In this channel, as long as you keep watching, we'll keep listening. We will see you in the next one.